Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my MSI round number 3 overview and analysis video. Round 3 feels kind of weird to say considering we're basically at the end of this tournament, but that is how it ends up breaking down. This is technically the only round 3 series. It's the top 4 series, the 4th place series, whatever you want to talk about, that's what we're on. The winner of this will be moving on to the semifinals to take on Billy Gaming for, of course, an opportunity to make the MSI finals. A lot on the line for both of these teams. I know a lot of you have been looking forward to this series and this video, so let me know down in the comment section below what you expected to see. Did it go according to plan for you, or were you surprised by the outcome? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions on everything down below. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts, you can check out the playlist in the iCard. In that playlist is every single MSI video that I've made so far this year. That's going to be the pre-tournament primer, my predictions for what was going to happen, every single play-in game, every single main brackets game, so it's got everything. It's got everything if you want to see it. Of course, in the end of yesterday's video, we talked about this series, we previewed it, I gave my prediction. We'll talk about that a bit more in this video, but most of it will be spent talking about the games itself. So without further ado, let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in this series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be talking about the semifinals at the end of this episode, losers finals, whatever you want to end up calling it, but most of today will be spent talking about this round 3 series. So let's get into the analysis. I really don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning of this because this series is a lot of fun. You can see it up on the screen. You already know why you're here. It's a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1 and the number 1 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports. These two teams have been on essentially opposite trajectories over the course of this tournament. Up until this point, G2, I think, has looked very good. They narrowly lost to this T1 team in round number 1. It was definitely a very close series. They ended up losing that game number 5, and they end up dropping down to the lower bracket, but they have not looked tested really at all since they've dropped down. It's against relatively good teams. PSG, maybe not like the most dominating team in the world, but 3-0ing them in very convincing fashion is a good sign. And then going on to destroy Top Esports, that is an amazing sign. The number 2 seed from the LPL really underperforming at this tournament in that series in particular, and G2 looking excellent. They have a lot of confidence, a lot of momentum going into the series, and really they have a very clear play style in terms of how they could potentially win a best of 5 against T1, because you're looking at what happened in the first series that they played against each other, and you're seeing that the problem was essentially just bot lane not being good enough. Caps was certainly good enough. Yike and Broken Blade, I thought, had really good series against T1. Broken Blade in particular has been very good at this tournament, but Hans and Mickey were not good at all against T1. If they are able to survive in this matchup, I think that there is a real opportunity for G2 to just be the better team. But for T1, a lot of the reason that I feel G2 has such a good opportunity here is because T1's been kind of bad at this tournament, at least in terms of what the expectations were from a lot of other analysts. This is who they were domestically, and I think people are surprised, like, oh my god, they didn't just get better internationally. Things didn't just figure itself out internationally. This is the same version of T1 we've had all year long. I'm not entirely surprised to see that. I think there is some natural concern with a team that has been so dominant internationally over the past 3 or even 13 years, if you really want to go to that, not being as good so far at this tournament, but I'm not entirely concerned. I think there are some things to be worried about, most notably Faker in the mid lane. I think it's just been not playing up to expectation. It's not been Faker, right? This has been the worst tournament he's had in a long time. He's still been relatively okay. That should show you how good Faker is. He's been better than quite a few other mid laners at this tournament, but it's not been Faker, right? It's not been a top 5 player in the world, which I think is kind of what you expected to see from him coming out of this, regular season, coming out of this playoff run where he was integral towards their success. He's kind of the reason they're here in the first place. It's a bit shocking to see him struggle so much, and certainly Caps is not the kind of player that's going to make it easier on him. This is going to be a difficult matchup for Faker that he has to survive, and Zeus and Owner have shown a lot of the continuous inconsistencies that they had in the regular season are going to carry over into these big moments. Zeus was very poor for this team in their playoff run domestically, especially in the finals. He was a big reason why they lost that series, and Owner always just gonna flip games. Like, there are gonna be some games where he's great, some games where he's bad. I think when you're looking at T1's avenues for success, bot lane definitely comes to mind. Their bot lane should just straight up be better like they were in the first round when these two teams went head to head, but I gotta be honest, if Zeus, Owner, and Faker are on point, they're going to win this series. I just don't know if you can expect all three of those things to happen. G2 has been really hot, and honestly, the last time these two teams played against each other, the drafts were a little bit worse for G2 than they have been in recent series. Maybe they figured something out, got a little bit more comfortable in the meta. I could definitely see a circumstance in which Broken Blade and Caps in particular in the solo lanes are able to generate their own leads. Yike does a good job facilitating that as long as Hans and Mickey play like human beings like they have over the last couple series. Like, G2 could win this, and I actually predicted G2 to win this. My prediction was G2 in 5, my spread was G2 in 5, T1 in 5. I do think this is closer to a 50-50 than a lot of the other series that we've seen. I would not expect either team to really just blow out the other. I think that would be a bit surprising for me, considering both of these teams do have their flaws that are exploitable. But I think G2 right now, the momentum, it just fills me with a lot of confidence. I think they actually have the talent to be able to get over the hump, again, so long as bot lane is able to survive. That would be my general prediction of this series, but predictions are all fun and good. It's always nice to preview what to expect, but the games are a different story entirely, and going game by game means we get to start off with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was T1. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. A big game number 1 win here to really solidify that confidence and that momentum and that synergy amongst the team. And I think the fact that they were able to do it in such dominating fashion is really a positive. This was your classic T1 game. Honestly, we haven't been seeing this as much over the course of 2024. In particular, we saw it a lot last year. 2022 is really when they started to develop this formula of, okay, things are relatively even in the early game. You're actually down 1k gold because you're losing in a couple of lane matchups, specifically Caps. Draven is generating a lot of gold. Like, there are positives for G2 in terms of the fights that they're able to take, but once we get further and further along in this game, one big play will set T1 so far apart from, what G2 is able to set up. Their macro's really good, and then it just takes one fight at 25 minutes, and all of a sudden the game is over. This is the T1 formula. Like, to the T, this is exactly how they are able to win games when they are at their most comfortable, and I think that's a very encouraging sign. For G2, I think you just kind of let T1 do the things that they wanted to do in this game. Yes, you were able to get a lot of gold on the Draven, and that was your win condition, but this is such an aggressive draft. You don't really have backup plans if things start to go wrong in the front-to-back 5v5. Kha'Zix is not going to be super relevant in that, situation. If Jax isn't strong, he's not going to be relevant in that situation, and if you don't really have any peel for Draven, he can just get dove on, and that's what we saw in this game, is that the Camille became a huge issue. Zeus is going to get player of the game. For me, he was unbelievably good here in game number 1, constantly diving the backline, especially in these pivotal fights, the 25-minute fight in particular, but I believe there was one around 19 minutes where he also was able to get on top of the Draven instantly, and even if you're trading 1-for-1, like I think they did at some points in this game, that's super worth it for you, because once Draven's out of this comp for G2, it's completely over for them. They cannot fight anymore, and so really like how Zeus played, not to mention the fact that he was like 6,000 gold up on Broken Blade by the end of this game, something ridiculous, completely outplayed him in the game, and Broken Blade got counterpick in draft. BB has been very good at this tournament, but there are concerns with his ability to be able to hold up mechanically against the other best top laners in the world if they are actually playing like the best top laners in the world. A lot of top laners at this tournament have been a little bit disappointing. Zeus, 369, they're not exactly the most dominating presences that we kind of expected to see, but this is what happens when Zeus is able to just 1v1, is able to get himself into a good position, and is able to translate his lead. You get dominating performances like this. I also want to give a big shout out to Gumayushi, who continues to be really good for this team. Surviving in the early game as Kalista here is very nice. Obviously, getting to play the Kalista matchup is definitely more of a positive for T1, all things considered, but Guma still played it very well. And again, I talk about this all the time, and it's more relevant in this series in particular. The difference between LCK and LPL bot laners on Kalista versus LEC and LCS bot laners on Kalista is super noticeable, specifically in late game teamfights. Gumayushi stayed relevant throughout the entirety of this game, and in fact, was probably more relevant as the game continued to go along. This is something he's become very well known for, is picking Kalista and being a teamfight carry, and you just don't see that in the West. You don't see AD carries continue to be able to be relevant on that champion as the game continues to go further. Guma was excellent. Keria was very good. A couple of those ultimates were really clutch, really well timed, especially with the Hextech ultimatums coming out from Camille. Faker was fine. I think some people are going to look at Caps and be like, wow, Caps was really good here. Faker survived the early game. That's what you're supposed to do on Orianna. Some of those shockwaves were good, but really wasn't all that relevant until the back half of the game. And then Owner was fine as well, whiffed some Sejuani ultimates, but you can survive with that because the macro was pretty good. So for T1, Zeus, Guma, definitely kind of the standouts in game number 1, but for G2, not really the draft I would have gone for. I know we've talked a lot about draft gaps that G2 has been able to get at MSI so far, but this is not one of them. Kha'Zix plus LeBlanc, a very aggressive mid-jungle duo that's really not in meta at all right now. You need to be able to pressure that mid-game. If you are not able to take that 1k gold lead that you had at 10, 12 minutes into the game and balloon that by 20 minutes, the game is kind of over because you cannot front to back, and T1 has a lot of tools to actually force that front to back. Yike was never relevant. He's going to get dead of the game. The Kha'Zix pick just not working out. It's cooking a little bit too much in draft, and I really think they were hurt because of that. That's not to mention the fact that Broken Blade got completely abused in the top lane matchup. He got counterpick on red side with the Jax and still got destroyed by the Camille. This is a really, really bad situation for BB. Again, he has to be better than this if G2 want any chance at being able to win this series. I know people are going to look at Caps and be like, yeah, Caps was okay in this game, and Hans was okay in this game, and, you know, he survived, and Mickey, you know, it probably his least valuable Poppy game of the tournament, but still not a horrible one. There are certainly takeaways, I would say, from this game, but none of them make me feel like G2 really had a grasp on it at all. They had a gold lead in this game, and it never felt like they were in control. They were constantly down in prio, in pressure, in macro, and I think that could be a determining factor, but it's just game one, and your draft is very aggressive. If you're able to rein it back in, maybe go for something that does have that playmaking ability in the early game, but actually has a little bit more sustainability if you need to front to back, I think that's going to help out a lot. And for T1, just stick to the formula. Allow your best players to go out and do things, and surround those players with supportive pieces like Sejuani, like Orianna, like the Renata. You can allow Zeus and Gumayusi to go and carry you games, especially if they're going to perform like they did here in game one. So really good game one from T1. Are they going to be able to generate that 2-0 series lead? Are they going to take a commanding lead here? Or is G2 going to even up the series and give us a really fun one moving into game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0. And how did they win this game? This really should not have been super winnable for T1, but what we've learned, I would say, over the course of this entire tournament, if there is one takeaway, it's that one of the things that I have been talking about a lot on this channel when it comes to roster building, when it comes to, you know, team projection, it rings very true. Your best players are great. You are as good as a team as your worst players. That has always been the case in League of Legends. That has always been how you need to build your roster. You need to build a team that just is versatile and doesn't really have any weaknesses, because you could have the best player in the game and you could still lose. We've seen it multiple times at this tournament. You know, Top Esports had it a couple of times in the upper bracket against Gen.G with Jackula potentially being the best player in that series and still losing it. And we're seeing it happen to Caps right now. I mean, there's really nothing else to say. You can make a strong argument that Caps was the best player in this game. I think that there absolutely is an argument to be made on that front. We will get into it. He obliterated the mid lane matchup, but it just didn't matter. The overall team of T1 was better. It didn't matter that they didn't have the best player, quote unquote, in the game in terms of the individual plays that were made before 15 minutes, because their ability to play team fights was just better. And that's really what it comes down to. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me, pretty obviously going to go to Gumayusi. He's having an amazing start to this series. He has been fantastic across this entire tournament. I think generally we're seeing the difference, specifically when Eastern teams go up against Western teams in the bot lane. That's just kind of been what we expected. Really, the only bot lane I was even remotely excited about coming out of the regular season or coming out of the domestic season was Team Liquid's. Yan and Core were doing really well domestically, but, you know, I've been very candid on this channel. Nobody from the LEC really excited me. Nobody else in the LCS really excited me. I felt like the biggest gap was going to be in the bot lane, and that's exactly what we're seeing right now. I don't even really blame Hans all that much. He tried his best here. He had to position super aggressively, and sometimes it was very poor. Sometimes he was way too far forward, but like I've always said on this channel, I'd rather my ADC, especially my Draven, be positioned too far forward and be trying to make plays than sit back and do absolutely nothing and lose the game. But Guma was just better. He was the best positioning team fighter in this entire game and was constantly dealing a ridiculous amount of damage because of it. Guma, being one of the best AD carries in the world, has very much shined through at this tournament, in my opinion, and he's been the best player on T1, I would say, across this tournament. Keria definitely had an argument, and he was really good in this game. A couple of wayward rogue Alistair engages that I think he would take back if he could, but most of them were pretty excellent, and most of them were really positive for T1 overall. Zeus and Owner were also fine. Zeus in particular really surviving on the top side of that matchup, even if the early laning phase wasn't perfect. He actually got out-roamed by the Urgot, never an ideal circumstance. And then, you know, Owner was good on the Poppy. Poppy's just generally a ridiculously solid pick at this tournament and has been for a super long time. If you can even remotely play Poppy, please prioritize that champion. It's just super good. But I'm gonna do the rare thing that I try not to do all that much, and that's give dud of the game to someone on the winning team. It's gonna go to Faker. I'm sorry. It just is. Faker was not good in this game, and people are gonna look and say, like, oh, some of those ultimates in the late game were good, and I think some of them were okay. Most of the time, you're just ulting the Nautilus back in, which is like, okay, sure, whatever. Like, you can probably already kill him. You didn't necessarily need that, and of course, he is technically the one who ends the game by hitting the Nexus and, you know, quote-unquote backdooring, even though it was not really a backdoor. He is technically the one who wins the game for his team, but man, he put them in such a hole in the early game. It was actually ridiculous. G2 had a gold lead for a majority of this game, and almost all of it was because of Faker. He is just not in the zone. I don't know what to tell you. Caps was infinitely better than Faker in game number 2. It just didn't matter. If you would have told me that at the beginning of the series, if you would have told me Caps was gapping Faker and it wasn't close and they were still losing, I would have felt really bad. But Faker needs to be better. If this team wants to compete against the best teams in the world, they need him to be Faker. They need him to be a top 5 player, and right now he's just not playing like that, even in the win. So for T1, I feel like they feel pretty lucky to get out of game 2 with a win, but they still earned it with their late game team fighting. You just never really want to be stuck in this situation. You know, you never want to feel like you have to win these fights in order to win the game. But for G2, it's unfortunate, man. Like, you tried, and honestly, most of the players played well. Caps was incredible in this game, and I do think Broken Blade did some interesting things, but the Urgot eventually just fell off and wasn't very relevant as this game continued to go further along. And then nobody else was really relevant at all either. It was really Aurelion Sol 1v9ing. Mickey X had a really poor back half of the game. Felt like he was doing really well in the early game to set up for the Draven and to at least keep him alive in these fights, but as the game continued to go along, like we said, he was actually prioritized pretty early on in a lot of these fights, and I think it was to the detriment of G2. Hans's positioning was just poor. You know, we talked about it again. I'm going to live with him being more aggressive, but it's going to come at the cost of him dying first in a lot of the fights where they really need his damage, and that's definitely not ideal, especially in a situation where it felt like Draven could theoretically carry this game. And then the Viego continues to just not work. It's 0-7 in the main bracket stage here of MSI. Yike looked okay in the early game again because he was able to get a lot of those kills. You know, in the mid lane, he was able to get a lot of gold through the mid lane because Faker was just way too far forward in a lot of situations. But again, this champion continues to not scale well into team fights, which is what he is supposed to do in the first place, even when he does have early game leads. And so I very much would like to see an adaptation from G2. Unfortunately for Caps, it just wasn't enough. If you can get a more stable team around him, you know, get rid of the Viego, get rid of the Draven, give him things that he can actually play around in a front-to-back 5v5, allow him to be your primary carry, your main guy in these 5v5s, but, you know, give the other team members opportunities to be able to set that up. I think that's going to be better than just kind of throwing a bunch of darts at the wall, throwing a bunch of carries at the wall, and seeing which one actually ends up sticking, which has kind of been G2's strategy in this series so far. And then for T1, if Faker's good, they're just gonna win. Like, it feels like everybody else is just in a really good spot right now. Guma and Keria continue to prove their dominance over G2's bot lane, and Owner and Zeus are actually having good series. If they're able to be taken off of some of their comfort picks, maybe you can survive in some of these games, but right now that just doesn't look like it's going to be all that probable. They are one game away from moving on to the semifinals. G2 one game away from having their MSI dreams dashed. LEC one game away from losing their opportunity to get 4 teams at Worlds, which would obviously be not ideal. If G2 can survive this, maybe they can start the comeback, but they have to start it here in game number 3. Are they going to be able to take it, or is T1 going to close out this series in a clean sweep? Well, the winner of game number 3 was T1. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to close out this series in a clean sweep, which was definitely a surprise to me. And they're going to be moving on to the semifinals, the lower bracket finals. They get their rematch against Billy Gaming. That's certainly what I'm excited to see. They're kind of going through their revenge tour right now, but to talk about this series, they dominated. They were the better team, and, you know, all 3 games were close. I want to make that, like, abundantly clear. I'm not trying to sit here and say that G2 got obliterated or anything in this series. It wasn't quite as much of a domination as some other series that we've seen in the past. Even at this tournament, there have been, you know, 3-game sweeps that have been worse than what happened to G2 here, for sure. They had a lead at 20 minutes, I think, in all 3 of these games, which is absurd, but they just could never out-teamfight T1. Their 5v5 was just so much worse, G2's was, that they just weren't actually able to ever protect any lead that they had. Their macro was a little bit slower, and really, you know, T1 time ended up taking over. We talk about it all the time on this channel. This is something we've said over and over and over again. 20 to 28 minutes in particular for T1. They're the best team in the world. Like, that's just what they are. It's what they have been over the past year especially, but even going into 2024, when you look at the ways that they were able to win the game domestically this year, 20 to 28 minutes, they're usually going into the mid to late game neutral, not even with a lead, and then they're just able to blow the game wide open with one fight and end it on the second, and people are like, how is this a 25-minute game? Like, that is the T1 formula. That's what people complain about all the time when it comes to the LCK, and all they did was take that and apply it to all 3 games of this series. So T1 very much in their comfort zone, and G2 unfortunately just not enough firepower to be able to keep up with that. So, you know, we'll talk about them. This is the end of their MSI run. Certainly not a bad run. Getting top 4 at this tournament is a huge dub. I think beating Top Esports was already such a massive success for this team, but I know they wanted a bit more. For T1, player of the game and player of the series is going to go to Zeus in the top lane. The top gap this series was pretty evident. You know, this is a pretty horrible matchup for the Jax. Really unplayable. I'm not sure why he blinded Jax on blue side. That feels like a pretty horrible decision in this particular matchup, and we'll get to Broken Blade. Does get the solo kill early on in the game because Zeus just like randomly takes a tower shot, you know, level 1, and Broken Blade is there to capitalize, but after that, it is rumble after rumble play after rumble play. He's dominating these fights. The equalizers were massive, especially around these major objectives. His Flame Spitter was doing a billion damage. Go look at the damage charts at the end of this game. Zeus was super relevant, was up like 60 CS in this game. I mean, he just obliterated the 1v1, and I get it, the matchup is super rumble favored, but you blinded Jax. Like, this is your fault. I don't mean to be that guy, but you can't get away with that against a team like T1. You're just not going to be able to survive in that matchup, and Zeus was the most valuable player to T1 in this game and in this series. I want to give a major shout out to Gumayushi. He definitely deserves player of the series nods as well. Unfortunately, I think Zeus was a bit better across all 3 games, but if you wanted to give it to Gumayushi, I think that's more than fair. I think he was better in this series than he was against Team Liquid, where he did get, you know, series MVP, or at least the broadcast gave him series MVP in that one. I think Guma was better here for sure. He was just so much better than Hansama in terms of his late game execution. Even on champions like Kalista, again, we talk about it all the time, but when you're an elite AD carry and you're able to teamfight super consistently on that Kalista pick, it just is a big separator of like the best from just the good AD carries, and I think that's kind of what we saw across this entire series between Guma and Hansama. Owner was also underratedly awesome in this game and in this series. I think this was his best game of the series, but Owner was very good here today, completely out-jungled Yike, and, you know, I think G2 kind of got a little bit lost in the sauce in terms of their drafts. I think this is certainly the most cohesive in terms of a 5-man unit, but this is something they used a lot against like Top Esports, but the LCK doesn't struggle with Ivern nearly as much as the LPL does, and I think Yike definitely struggled to find breakpoints, ends up not being able to pick up a couple of pretty crucial kills in the mid game, and actually ends up getting pretty hard outscaled because of that. The Ivern was just never relevant in this game. Even the shields were not all that relevant in this game because Caps just couldn't consistently stay in the fight, and Owner, I think, out-jungling him, and the macro advantage that T1 had in this series has to be attributed to jungle. Owner had a very good one. Faker definitely played fine in this game number 3, certainly his best game of the series. They still tried to pump a lot of resources into shutting him down. It just didn't work nearly as well as it did in the first couple of games. Talia will do that. That champion is just kind of a free out. Allowing Faker to have that, I think, was a mistake. And then Carrier on the Nautilus was also very good, sometimes a little too far forward, but you can live with that. Zeus and Guma were the stars here. Owner, very quietly, also one of the better players in this series, and T1 across the board, again, the stronger of the teams. Even if they're not winning in the early game, even if their 1v1 laning isn't always perfect in the mid lane and in the bot lane, they're so much better than other teams in 5v5s that they can win this tournament. They can win this tournament off of that alone. We saw it at Worlds last year. That's exactly what they did, is they won that tournament based off their team fighting basically by itself. So really excited to see what T1 does now moving into the semifinals, but unfortunately for G2, this is the end of their MSI run. I think they expected a bit more. They went into the series, I think, looking at themselves as favorites, but just couldn't quite keep that momentum from that sweep over Top Esports. A very different look from G2. First of all, they were heavily outdrafted in the first 2 games, and that was one of their big advantages in some of the previous series, was just how many advantages they were able to get in draft and how comfortable they were on some of their picks. They were still comfortable here, but not a lot of synergy in the first 2 games. I think the Game 3 draft is certainly the most cohesive from a 5v5 perspective, and that's kind of what T1 is going to force on you if you're not able to close out games fast enough. But the problem is the execution was a bit worse here in Game 3 than it was in the others. Even still, you had a gold lead for a majority of this game. Hansama, in particular, had his best game of the series, and they were actually able to get a pretty big lead in lane. It just didn't actually translate into them being able to win fights. Again, Hans is not as good in the 5v5 as Gumayushi. We knew that going in. Hans' weakness as a player is his team fighting, and so when you're relying on him in a lot of these big circumstances to win front to back, it's just not the kind of player that he is. He's not the kind of guy who can fill that role. Caps can fill that role, and the Tristana at times in this game was looking like it was going to be able to take over some fights, but there was one crucial one, obviously, right below mid lane where Caps just gets caught early early on, gets Vi-ulted, and the Ivern shields aren't enough to save him, and once Caps is gone, it's just game over. There is absolutely no way for them to win a fight from that point onwards, because he is their star. Broken Blade's gonna get done of the game, completely outplayed, down 60 CS, no pressure. Yes, he got a solo kill at level 1. Awesome. He turned it into literally nothing. Got obliterated the rest of the game, the rest of the laning phase. He was late on some of these engages as well. Just a couple of really weird plays coming in from him. I don't know why you go Jax here in game number 3, especially blind. I think it's a pretty ridiculous call. I don't think it synergizes super well with the rest of the team. I think it's just a mistake, but, you know, for G2, they tried their best. They definitely did better at this tournament than I was anticipating. I thought the top 4 were clearly the top 4, and they displaced one of those top 4 in top esports. It just wasn't enough for them to be able to get to top 3. I think that would have been a major achievement, and it certainly was possible, but on today's day, T1 was just straight up better, and you just have to live with that. They go back to the LEC as big favorites to continue to win that, and clearly the best team in the West at the moment. But for T1, they move on now to face Bilibili Gaming. We'll preview that in just a second, but for them to make top 3, I think they will consider that an accomplishment, even if they're not able to get to the finals. I know they expect to make finals. I know that's the kind of team, you know, they expect to win every tournament and everything that they're at. It's T1. That's the expectation for this org, but I think realistically speaking, if you would have told me T1 got 3rd at this tournament, I think they would take that relatively well. Maybe they have a date with Destiny with their LCK brethren in Gen.G in their final future, but I don't know. We'll have to see. I think the Bilibili series is going to say a lot, but at least T1 feels like a very well-rounded team that has a very clear idea of what they want to do in the game right now. Alright, but that is going to do it for my MSI round number 3 overview and analysis video. We know our top 3 teams at MSI in 2024 now. Gen.G awaiting the winner of the semifinals in the finals. It's Bilibili Gaming taking on T1. Very excited to see where that series ends up going. Of course, we've already seen it at this tournament. BLG ended up winning 3-1 in pretty convincing fashion. They were definitely the better team in that series. There was a lot to like about the way that they played a lot of those games. I think that there were a couple of players that are playing well at this tournament, all things considered. Elk and On have been pretty good, Elk in particular, and I think Bin is also one of the better top laners at this tournament for sure. But there are some concerns after that Gen.G series. Knight kind of just got completely outplayed, and while Faker is struggling right now, Faker is also the type of player and person where if he goes out and just dominates and just steps it up and figures it out and just, you know, is one of the best mid laners in the world again, are we really going to be all that surprised? Like, Knight's going to need to show that he can be better against T1 than he was against Gen.G, and that's certainly something to monitor, and more specifically, Jun needs to be better. Jun got completely outplayed by Canyon in their Gen.G series. To me, that was the biggest gap in terms of individual positions in that winner's finals. That cannot happen against T1. If you give Owner an inch, you know, him and the team will take a mile, and so you have to be a lot more disciplined. You have to be able to play the way that you were able to play domestically. I understand the idea for BLG is to dive bot, get Elk super far ahead, and to transition the game out of control from there. That has worked every single time they played against T1, and so I don't really see a reason for it not to work here, but they were figured out a bit against Gen.G. Potentially T1 has some techs to be able to beat it. You have to be more versatile if things are not working in the first game or so of this series. So I'm still predicting Bilibili to win this. My prediction is going to be BLG in 4. I don't see any reason to predict anything else. My spread, BLG in 4, BLG in 5. I think T1 should make it interesting. This team is simply just too good to roll over and die, although I wouldn't be stunned if BLG just figures it out and goes out in 3-0s, but my expectation is that BLG should be getting their rematch with Gen.G in the finals. I think T1 definitely has the chance to win this. They're good enough to win this. We know that. They won Worlds with this group last year. They went to World Finals the year before. We know this team is good enough to win MSI, but so far I'm still a bit concerned about the consistency, especially if Faker is going to struggle into Night, but would love to know whether you agree or disagree with that down in the comment section below, and let me know what you thought of the video. Did you enjoy it? If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you are new here, hit subscribe. Like we said, we're covering the final 2 series of MSI, you know, basically daily on this channel, so if you're interested in that, hit subscribe, and then the summer split's right around the corner, and we cover all 4 of the major regions every single week on this channel, and so if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all